So I'm delighted to be joined by Johnny Boston, who has made a film about one of the founding fathers of transhumanism, which is coming out tomorrow, but it'll almost certainly be out by the time people watch this. So Johnny, first of all, thank you very much for your time. This film is going to be available on Amazon, on a lot of other major streaming platforms. It's called 2030. And perhaps you could kind of tell us about where you got interested in this individual.
Yeah, well, I met FM-2030, and that was his legal name when I was a kid, when I was about 11 or 12 years old. He'd come to London with his partner at the time, and they stayed with us. And he was, he looked like a Bond villain, number one. So that was kind of, and he was very charismatic. And I guess he was one of the first adults that spoke to me, not as a child, but as a grown up. So that was interesting. And then he had these really kind of off the wall ideas, that we were going to live on indefinitely, that we were going to, that there was going to be a much more sort of progressive politics, that we were going to have, we talked about this future that was just around the corner, that we were going to do all sorts of things. We were going to communicate, brain-to-brain communication. There was going to be a machine that you could put in like various characteristics and it was going to print stuff. And again, this is in the 70s or early 80s. And it was kind of really off the wall,
Yeah.
So as a kid, who's interested a little bit in science fiction and so on. But actually, I'd only really thought about science fiction in a really dystopian way. And so here was this guy saying, actually, it's all going to be fun and crazy, and we're going to have, so that was compelling. So that was how I met him originally. And then later on, when I left the UK and I went to America, I went to Los Angeles, partly because he was living there. And so I got to know him. And so that was how I came across his radar. I didn't really, he'd written a book, I think, when I was in LA called Are You a Transhuman? But I'd never heard the term transhuman, didn't really, that was something that was very new. And, that was obviously captured my own imagination because I was interested in film. And so it's been a long, any film about him particularly, or film that I had wanted to do had been a long time coming. Especially because when he got diagnosed with cancer and then he was, he died, but he was cryogenically suspended. So, that in and of itself was different. I don't have too many friends that have been cryogenically suspended, or people I know. So that was compelling as well.
My understanding, he had quite an interesting childhood. I think he spent it in kind of spread across lots of different countries. Do you think that in any way contributed to his kind of later interest in science and politics?
Yeah, his father, I think, was the ambassador to the US, and so he got to live in all these different countries. I always think, even in terms of other people that I've met, that when you get to live in different backgrounds, you have to sort of adapt and see. And if you're somebody who pays attention, then yeah. And then he worked at the UN and he was in the Olympics, so he was this very kind of Renaissance man. Yeah. But how did that inform what he was to become? Yeah, I think that when you live in different places, you start to think about how the world's... Well, I think you can go either of two ways. You can either think about how unique you are and how special you are and how, and revert to sort of very nationalistic, from a nationalistic place, or you can start to think about how similar we are and what's dividing us. And I think so some of that, I think, definitely informed, his philosophy.
Yeah. Do you think that the kind of his vision of transhumanism is roughly where the movement is at the moment?
Is what? Sorry, I missed the last part.
Is on where the movement is at the moment. So it's kind of like what he saw transhumanism as. Is that roughly what the movement's actually developed into?
Well, I think these things, like most things, everybody has their own sort of definition. I think there are aspects of what he thought that definitely, have permeated this idea of transhumanism. But we all want to put each other and ourselves in buckets. Like, if somebody was to ask me, I wouldn't necessarily define myself as a transhuman. Do I think that we are living at a time that is not necessarily more special than other times, but change has been happening so rapidly. my kids are never going to be in a car that probably doesn't have navigation. There's so many silly things. I mean, the fact that we're doing this. I mean, if you'd have said to my dad, or to me, you'd be like, yeah, that's Star Trek. That's this, that's that. So yeah, I think we're living in a time where, I mean, if I was more, the more sort of scientific answer is, we've changed more rapidly in the last few decades than we have for millennia. And yet most of our biology has stayed the same, except that we're now changing our biology. And I think that was sort of the essence of it, is that are we going to be this same species? Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I can't speak to, am I a new species if I implant stuff, or I can do various things that my parents or can't do? But to me, it does sort of evoke this new way of thinking, this new way of being that is going to have really crazy ramifications, or good, bad, some of which we don't know. So yeah, I think we're definitely on the precipice of something. Now, again, whether that's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, that's for us to sort of either make happen or work out. But yeah, we're definitely at a pivotal moment where we can do really amazing things technologically and scientifically that are going to have profound effects on who and what we are. Now, whether that makes us a different species or beyond human, or, that's a question of definition, I think.
Yeah. I mean, how big a role do you think FM-2030 played in kind of popularizing transhumanism?
A lot. I mean, it's weird, in researching and in looking at the film, there are so many areas that FM has touched. I mean, even in the last few months, there's a fashion line, there's like 2 music tracks, he sort of touches all sorts of areas. Now, because I think, he's billed as the father of transhumanism. I don't know, would he have liked that? Probably. I mean, he had as much sort of ego as anybody. Yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely, when people didn't want to, when he first started talking about this, there were a lot of people who kind of resisted this label. And even me, I'm sort of not wanting to be labeled or whatever. So, but there are a whole bunch of people today who, number one, like being futurist, like being transhuman. You've got Zoltan running for president under a transhuman label. You've got a whole bunch of philosophers, people even at Oxford and Cambridge who, under this futurist sort of banner, who are happy to call themselves transhuman, extropian. I mean, there's all sorts of, like everywhere, there's all sorts of brands now of transhumans, transhuman radicals, transhuman extropian. I mean, some really fun and interesting different avenues of transhumanism. So short answer is, yeah, I think he had a profound effect on what we now call transhumanism,
I mean, as someone who was actually lucky enough to know him, what was he like as a person, if that's not too personal a question?
Oh, it's not in the least bit personal. I mean, he was really fun. I mean, that's why I gravitated to him. I mean, number one, I was sort of argumentative anyway, and I liked contrarian people, as long as they weren't like stupid or crazy. I like that. So yeah, I mean, he was the sort of like you go out with, even as a young person, not to feel like, oh, there's like a weird adult with us. I mean, he was, he was a magnet for people. He was very charismatic and he was funny. I think part of it was that he liked the fact that he looked like this. He had a big scar on his face. He was, he definitely walked into a room and you're like, who's that guy, And so, he had a really funny sense of humor. I mean, it wasn't, there's, I don't want to say anything disparaging about American sense of humor, whatever. I mean, he was sarcastic. There were things that, even, he liked getting a reaction. I mean, so for me, certainly he was a fun person. I mean, there were, I never heard him say very few, like he wasn't like a hater or he didn't disparage, but he liked most people and tried to find good in most people. But he had a different way of looking at the world. I mean, I've been really lucky in my career. I've got to meet lots of like successful, interesting people. And, everybody talks about, oh, so-and-so is a maverick, or so-and-so is an out-of-the-box thinker. But honestly, in my life, I've only met a few people like that who really do look at something and see it in a completely different way. I've met more than a few, if you include people who are completely crazy and out of their minds. but he definitely was an original and a fun person and a thoughtful person. Look, when I was, he gave me a lot of his time and he didn't need to. I don't know if he just liked me, but also because I think he was that sort of person. He was the sort of person that wanted to listen, wanted to hear, especially from younger people. He was very like, I'm not. Well, he thought he was the future, but he also realized that this wasn't going to be about my parents. It was going to be all, older people. This was going to be a future that was brought. Now I can look at you and say, you are the future, not me. Now I feel very old because I can't shave and I've got a grey beard. But he was very like wanted to hear people's thoughts, particularly if they were young. And he wanted to almost be dismissive of things that were I can't do with two hands. I was going to do like a old world type things. So he was dismissive of like opera and classical music, of which, for me, I wasn't that into anyway. So that was fine. So I hope that gives you a little sort of, what he was like. Yeah.
No, I mean, you kind of mentioned this as well. Is that transhumanists seem to be getting more politically active. So obviously, I mean, especially in the last kind of half decade or so. So obviously, you've got Zoltan standing for the presidency in America. You've got a transhumanist party UK in the UK. I mean, there are transhumanist parties popping up all over the world. I mean, what do you think he would have thought about that, about the increased engagement with politics?
I mean, you got Andrew Yang, who really did very well in the presidential, in the Democrat presidential primaries. Who he may not have transhumanist manner, but adopts all sorts of aspects of what contemporary transhumanism means.
Yeah.
We did a series of films called The Future of Democracy that came out of talks that FM had done, and they're on a channel called the Galactic Public Archives. And it's a series of these videos where he really talks about what the future holds in terms of how we govern ourselves and politics and so on. And so in his how he thought the things would play out, there's part where he says, look, we've got to reinvent how we govern ourselves, and we've got to utilize AI, and we've got to utilize, you've got to get everybody to vote on issues, not on people. Now, so in part, he would have been disappointed that still today it is very much sort of cult of personality, and I'm not going to call anybody out on that, but I think part of like how we do things today is going to remain the same until there's this huge upheaval and we figure out that people are very flawed, and systems that sort of talk about one person as being the embodiment of like what we want in terms of laws, in terms of society, in terms of regulation is flawed. But how we reshape that, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, there's a lot of people I spoke to that I thought were really interesting. There's a guy in England called Khan Ross, who was a diplomat and certainly wouldn't don the banner of transhumanism. Yeah, there's a lot of views that he has about how we need to reshape our politics that, could be plucked from some of the pages of FM. So I guess the short answer to that is I think he would have been pleased in that some of the issues that were important to him, non-violence, technology, how we use technology, those sorts of things, even, making the end of death or figuring out how we can live longer and better, sort of front and center, how we can bring people together, not push people apart. So I think he'd been really pleased that all these different factions, if you like, it always reminds me of The Life of Brian. He would have been pleased that there was these voices that were out there. Would he have been over the moon about, transhumanist party? I mean, there's this great line in one of the videos that we did on the future of democracy where he says, listen, like, he takes to task, monarchies, for example, and so and the White House and all of this. He said, there's people, they're not going to go quietly. I mean, all these, and again, I probably in today's terms, you'd say all these sort of like old white men, you know, who've been in power for decades, millennia, for whatever, they're not going to give up that power that easily. I mean, people now often say to me, like, how would FM have explained Donald Trump? And I've thought about it a bunch, and I think he would have said something like, look, we've had all these progressive, I know progressive is like a dirty word here in America, or at least for part. I mean, for me, it means progress. It means getting better, right? So I think he would have said, I think he'd have said, you know, Obama was sort of a lightning rod of progress, of an end to various racisms, etc., and a lightning rod for positive change. And there's definitely some truth to that. And then along comes Trump, and then various other things across the world. And I think he would have said, listen, like, change is really hard. We as human beings are, that by definition, changing all the time. And yet we have a hard time with these big shifts. And often, especially if those big shifts affect us personally, or our tribe, or our country, or our belief system, we push back. And those people who push back play on fear and play on jingoism and racism, and I think he would have said it's a symptom of that. It's a symptom of growing pains. That we're going to take a bunch of steps forward, and we're going to, you know, and even in this, I mean, he would have loved Trump's sort of like space, not space soldiers, but like, you know, he would have loved this idea that we're now embracing going out into outer space and space colonies and all the rest of it. But you know, I think he would have looked at Trump and various other things in the world as sort of, you know, steps back, because the powers that be are really frightened. And he would have, you know, I think he would have been sort of empathic to their fears. Like, yeah, I mean, you know, things have got to shift. And I think that's how he would have explained. And that's sort of, in my own mind, how I rationalize some of the stuff that seems really bizarre to me in American politics anyway. That's how I try and rationalize it.
I mean, transhumanism always seems to me to be kind of a bit of a vanguard movement, in the sense that it's kind of discussing technologies and issues which are going to become, I suppose, mainstream issues in perhaps 20, 30 years' time. Do you think FM was kind of conscious of being part of a vanguard? Do you think that's how he saw himself?
Yeah, I mean, I once said to him, I mean, you know, would you like your books to be sort of bestsellers? And he said to me, and I thought this was weird. He said, listen, because he was always invited on various talk shows, and often he would miss things because he was late. And I'm like, I think I'd seen him. I think we were living near, and we went for a walk together. And he's like, oh, you know, I was supposed to do this thing at NBC, and I'm like, well, why didn't you do it? And he's like, oh, I woke up late, and you know, they wanted to schedule it at 9 in the morning, and you know, most people, authors today or whoever, would be really like upset at themselves and be like, oh my God, I missed this huge opportunity. And and I'm like, well, don't you want your book? I think that's where it came. I said, don't you want your book to be a bestseller? And he said, no. And I said, well, why? And he said, because if it was a bestseller, if everybody embraced these things, then I'd be doing something wrong. My job is to sort of forecast the future or talk about the future in ways that probably do make people uncomfortable, because you know, these ideas, you know, are going to take effort. I mean, I think somebody said to me, well, what makes him different than a lot of futurists and technologists that are saying these things? And I think part of it was, in some ways, people read him even now and sort of say, oh, you know, he was being very cavalier about what this future was. But if you read the books, like, it was this really sort of in-depth look, particularly some of his early books, you know, at like in order for us to achieve this isn't going to be like, it's just going to happen. We're going to invent something, you know. He wrote this thing and he was panned for, it was basically, he didn't call it a 3D printer, but I think the New York Times called it a Father Christmas machine. That was basically 3D printing. And he wanted to sort of be ahead of the curve. And he felt like if everybody embraced it, then he'd be doing something wrong. Except, and again, I'm not sure how sort of like cavalier or, you know, him being in his own brand was, except that once we got to 2030, then it would all be falling into place, you know, all these things. But again, I'm not sure if that was more, you know, his brand of things or whether he really believed that. But I guess what I'm saying is the future that he wanted, which was a nice future where we're getting along better, not trying to, hurt each other and kill each other all the time. I'm talking about, us as human beings. He felt like that was something that wasn't just going to happen because we invented something, that we'd have to work at that. And there was going to be people that were going to be catalysts, and again, he loved, I've now forgotten her name, I'm going to sound silly, that this girl who spoke at the UN, about climate change.
Greta Thunberg, something like
that. Love, and that, that's, he would have like, this was a catalyst. She's in sparking the imaginations of people and getting people leaders to really sort of look at themselves. So, it wasn't just this, which again, I think some people in this movement sort of adopt, like, yeah, science is going to fix everything, technology is going to fix everything, and it's all going to be okay. For him, technology was going to help, science was going to help, but it really was about, us sort of changing what's important to us.
How did he respond to critics of the movement? One thing I found quite interesting, I think it was in the very early 90s, is Francis Fukuyama wrote an article called "The Most Dangerous Ideology in the World," and he picked transhumanism. And essentially his argument seemed to be that it would result in such disparity in human intellect that it wouldn't be compatible with one person, one vote democracy. How did he respond to kind of critics like that?
It's funny because his main critic in America was a guy called Alvin Toffler, who wrote a book called Future Shock, which was sort of a precursor to the book, the Francis Fukuyama book. It was the end of history or something. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah. And they became friends. And in fact, I think he wrote I don't think I'm wrong, but I think Toffler wrote the foreword to one of his books. And I think what happened at first, it was very contentious. It was more like, and I think once they sat down and they talked, I think they were on a talk show or something together. I think the foreword of the book was like, look, we've had our differences in terms of how things are going to play out, but he really is insightful, and I really hope that I'm wrong and he's right, kind of thing. So I think part of it was charm. So I don't know how he would have responded specifically in terms of that book, but I think he would have probably said, listen, like most of the time, and me as an English person, definitely more in this camp, but not. We go to like dystopian scenarios. We look at the world, through this sort of lens of fear rather than sort of a lens of like, cooperation or whatever. So I think it would have been a thoughtful response anyway. I don't know exactly how we would respond to those critics, except to say, look, he definitely had lots of, even now I noticed on, we had a comment on one of the YouTube videos or whatever, and it was, how do you, if there's going to be no death and, all of this, we're going to have overpopulation and so on. And he had very specific arguments that sort of made that, that kind of, not only took it to task, made it sort of irrelevant and almost stupid because of various things that we can do, as it relates to overpopulation. And then when the planet really does get too hot and so on, we'd have Mars colonies or space colonies or whatever. But even in the short term, he had a very specific, thought out argument that sort of made these sort of assumptions that every sort of like big not horror movie, big sort of adventure movie that talks about, volcanoes and what have you, that we're all going to die because of some crazy natural disaster. He took all those sorts of things into account and also said, we like to focus on these things, but actually the odds of this happening and the fact that, we thought about ways that we can sort of respond to all of that, basically.
Yeah, one thing I found kind of interesting, because as we're saying, I've been talking to a whole variety of people within the movement, and quite a few people have mentioned to me that there seems to be a kind of statist libertarian divide, which is becoming more pronounced within transhumanism. Perhaps very ugly, you could call it left-right. I noticed on Zoltan's website, one of his main reasons for standing as Republican, he says, is that he's concerned about the movement's becoming taken over by politically correct culture and so on. I spoke to David Pearce, who kindly put us in contact, and he said that was something he'd been very aware of. But I was wondering if that's something you'd noticed, and what you thought FM would make of it.
Yeah, look, I think what's clear to me is that we love here again. I've been living here for a long time. And it's so clear to me that things that these definitions of, you know, libertarianism versus conservatism versus progressivism, both people really focus on them, and if you do focus on them, then it's a way of both pushing people away and bringing some people together. And like I said earlier, like liberalism has a really dirty word here. So is progressivism even. Yeah. If you're a progressive, or globalist, it's even worse. What does that mean? I mean, for me, it means, you know, I'd like to live in a planet where, you know, I feel at home in most places and I'm accepted in most places. So yeah, I think there is a fracturing. I think there is, you know, people take on one thing and they can't let go of their own. I was going to say programming, but it's not even programming. You know, these ways that we define ourselves. These ways, you know, I'm a libertarian because I smoke pot and I like guns and what have, you know, for here, or I'm, you know, I don't want the government telling me what to do. Well, I think in its totality, ideally, transhumanism doesn't want the government telling what to do, but wants a government that's going to actually do the things that government does, which is, you know, give us roads and gives us security and helps us with schools, you know. So I think he would have been a bit disappointed. Look, I think if he'd still been alive, like he because he was charismatic, he maybe could have helped people come together, you know, in this way that would have been more. I mean, I don't know whether it would have been more. I think we're living right now, and part of it's what I said earlier, in these times where we really do want to, you know, define, you know, who is James? Is James, who did James vote? You know, we're so, I think because things are so charged, the thing that we revert to is something that defines us. You know, I'm Jewish, I'm this, I'm whatever it is. And I think that helps us feel comfortable about who we are and what we are. So I think it'd have been a little bit. I think the short answer is I've noticed it. I think it's true. I think if FM was alive, perhaps it wouldn't. You know, again, maybe I'm overstating it. Maybe it wouldn't have become so fractured, but maybe it still would. And look, you know, I'm going to try and look at the positive. I think it's good that people are out there and they're talking about these things. How it all pans out, you know, I mean, I don't think Zoltan Itzvan's getting elected anytime soon. Let's but it's cool that he's, you know, at least getting people thinking and talking about all of this stuff, I think.
I mean, one thing I've kind of noticed is that, I mean, when you read transhumanist writings from kind of 10, 20 years ago, and you now look at the stuff that governments are actually investing in, I mean, they're often the same things. So things like, you know, obviously AI and robotics and gene editing and so on. But now that the governments are starting to take serious interest, I mean, so for example, Vladimir Putin saying that, you know, the country that first masters AI will rule the world. Do you think that now state actors are getting involved and big corporations are getting involved? That some of the kind of the early utopianism of the movement is kind of being sucked out, and it's becoming more. I don't want to say authoritarian, but it's becoming kind of more. There are more bad actors getting involved in the game, if that makes sense.
Look, there's part of me that loves that because I'm a filmmaker and I like narrative and I like big drama. I like the idea of that. I mean, so look, I mean, these things, I don't want to say trendy, but these things are important. I mean, we're talking about things that are going to have such implications. So it's not surprising to me that corporations are getting involved, because the way our system works is someone's got to make money and you know, and then you have, you know, various corporations, particularly in the UK, I mean, places like John Lewis, who aren't the traditional corporations that are looking after their employees, are doing various things that make it more, I don't know, palatable. I mean, look, what's a corporation supposed to do? They want to make money for their shareholders and so on. So the fact that, yeah, there's a lot of corporations that want to be involved in gene editing and you know, patents on DNA and all of this, which on the one hand, like, is, can I swear on this?
Yeah, go for it. I'll cut that out for the Express, but you can swear on these.
It's really fucked up and scary that somebody can own a patent on your DNA, you know. So yeah, the fact that governments need to think about this for sure. Do they need to regulate it? Again, very anti whatever libertarian, the libertarian aspects. Yeah, I think they do. I think, you know, we interviewed a guy, I think his name's Ray McCauley, he's a bioengineer and bioethicist, and he's like, look, you know, I am a libertarian, you know, and you know, on the one hand, I don't want the government in my business telling me how I should do my experiments. But on the other hand, look, you know, these things can have crazy implications. I can invent a virus that, you know, on the one hand can fix all sorts of things, or a nanorobot, but on the other hand can be really can be put to really like evil, malicious ways. And it's biohackers in your mum's. I think the line was, you know, you have to worry about the biohacker in your grandmother's basement, which I always thought was a funny line. But like, you know, so that, you know, these things that in some ways are so easy. Oh yeah, I'm a libertarian. You know, I think if you sort of start to think about the big picture, like we need to have government, some regulation around the things that we can do, and we need to have philosophers really discuss not just the ramifications, but there's always unintended consequences, you know, in all these progressive things that we do. So I think I've gone past your question. I think your question.
Very interesting. But no, Johnny, that I really enjoyed our chat. Thank you very much for that. Just to remind people, so your film, it'll be out by the time this goes out. So it's called 2030. It's available on, it's Amazon Prime?
I think Amazon Prime in the UK, iTunes, Amazon Prime. I mean, I'll send you the list that we have. And in fact, I can probably even today, we should be getting links from all these places. So it'll be available widely in the UK, not so widely in Australia, widely in the UK on various platforms. And it's going to roll out on other platforms too. So, be available on a conventional broadcast soon as well. Yeah, so I hope people check out the film and enjoy it, and hopefully it sparks a lot of interesting conversation. I mean, that's the thing. I'm just trying to fly my flag a bit.
Yeah,
it's time to wake up. Hopefully that's our little tagline. And yeah.
Well, no, thank you very much.